Thank you very much. Can you hear me? So I'm very happy to be here, and I really very much appreciate this invitation. I've heard many things about the university here, so I always wanted to come, and I've never been. So I'm very happy that I finally get to see the campus, and I hope I can entertain you with my presentation. So a little word on some credits. So some of the work I'll be talking about goes very far back, and it covers literally hundreds of papers, and so therefore giving credit to every paper would make it a very boring talk. So I'm going to completely skip any credit, but if you are very interested in a particular kind of work, I can give you references afterwards. And it's also, I definitely want to claim that this is not my only work. So these were the people that did a lot of work with me when I led the research team in New York, in Google, and they have a lot to do with it. But the speech team at the moment is much bigger. So there's another 240 people in the speech team, and they all contributed one way or the other to this work. And I also want to credit other universities and other companies, because we go to conferences and we compete or listen to each other, and that really progresses the field. So this is not a single person effort, it's definitely a community that pushes things forward. But I think it's interesting to see what comes out of it. So I joined Google in 2005 with 4 other people, and Google sort of decided that they wanted to build up speech recognition technology and hired a couple of experts to sort of build it. And at that point we were in research because there was no real application except for the horrible things that you saw, and we started sort of playing with the technology. And so we had sort of 3, I think, early launches of technology. And so one of them is mobile. And again, let me emphasize how quickly the world can change. So in 2005, Google was very famous. And a lot of people knew Google. But the only way to get to Google is at your desktop. So you be at home at your computer, that's where there's Google. There's nowhere other place where there's Google. And people all had a cell phone, but the cell phone goes like this. It's not like this. So it was used to make phone calls. There was no internet on your cell phone. So if you wanted to call a restaurant, and you're walking outside, you can't Google it to figure out what the phone number is. And your phone has no internet, so how do you deal with it? So we built an application called 1-800-GROUP-411. And if you would call this, you get an automated system where you can ask, I want to go to this restaurant, this is the name, and if you get the speech recognition right, then we would give you the number or connect you to the restaurant. And so that was quite popular. And that was a bit less, people would understand it once in a while if you get it wrong, but it wouldn't be a horrible interaction like we had before. So people started getting a bit more used to it being useful. So the other thing we did is was left me. So people use a lot of voicemail still. And so you get a message from somebody and they go blah, 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 blah. And then at the end they always go, oh, please call me back at this number. And then if you miss the number, then you have to remind it and try to find it. So this is a very painful interaction. So we started doing transcription of your voicemail, so that on your computer you could search your messages, or you could easily find the phone number and so forth. And again, that was quite popular, not super popular, but people started noticing that maybe speech recognition is useful for something. And the last thing that we still are actively busy with is cross-captioning on YouTube. So if you're deaf, you hate YouTube because there's no subtitles, and there's nothing else they can see. Right? So it's very popular, and deaf people also want to look at YouTube, but if there's no access to it. So we automatically transcribe YouTube, and even if you're not, there are lots of other languages that you probably don't speak. And so with automatic translation, we can translate the text as the subtitles, and suddenly you can watch this Mexican soap even though you don't speak Spanish. Right? So when we launched that, the error rates were really horrible. So people made a lot of fun of us that this doesn't work at all. But again, sort of the Google way to say, this is a new technology. We know it doesn't really work well, but let's see how far we can get that issue. So now this really describes, the revolutionary change of going from we hate speech recognition to we love speech recognition. And of course, one of the big things that has an impact on this was 2007. So in 2007, both Apple and Android launched the smartphone. We're now used to calling a cell phone. And of course, you can type at it, so you can use your thumbs and type whatever you want to do. And people really hate that. People don't like typing at a cell phone because it makes mistakes. And so suddenly, we were giving people the option to use speech, and that might be actually less painful. and we started seeing people actually using speech. And unlike the horrible interaction we saw before, where people have no way out, right? And you have to talk to the horrible woman, otherwise you can't get any information. People can still use their tongues, but we started seeing more and more people actually using voice to do input because it's less painful. I had sort of a moment when I was driving around in California when I saw the first time somebody holding a phone like this, talking to it. So I can tell that they're not talking to a person, right? They're talking to the machine. It's like, wow, people actually use our stuff. So this really was an inflection point. From there on, the speech movement was first in research. We got moved to Android because it's such a big part of it, and we just saw traffic go up and up and up. People started really adopting speech recognition. So, look at a little bit at the high level what is going on here, right? So there's of course a lot going on, and so that I'm not going to describe in detail, but just to sort of make sure that you understand what's going on at a high level. So you have your device, your phone or your tablet, and you talk to it. So there's some speech aid that you have coming in. And over the internet we send this into the cloud, so to some data center that Google has somewhere. And there's a big computer that has a recognizer that has some kind of model sitting there. And it tries to find, there's a probabilistic model, tries to find the most likely word sequence that goes in the audio. Searching for probability of W given A. That's the most likely text that goes in the audio. And sometimes, we just leave you back the text, right? So if you send an SMS or something, the end result is text, right? You want to send a message and just have it transcribe whatever you just said as a message to your friend. Right? Please pick up some help, that's the answer. But sometimes they're different, right? So if you ask for how tall is Barack Obama, you don't want the text, you actually want to do a web search with it. So there might be a whole other system that's that trigger. If you're driving around, maybe you ask for directions to a particular address, you don't want the answer to be text, because when you're driving, you can't read the text on your phone. So we need text to speech sometimes to generate the answer in the spoken form. But essentially, the speech recognition part of it is sort of the crux of it, right? So it's sort of speech in, answer out, where the answer can be complicated, but that's sort of the main mode of operation. So if you look what's going on in there, there's nothing really remarkable in what we do. So there's sort of three main modeling components. So one of them is the acoustic model, that sort of matches the audio that you see to the different sounds that you might. So if you see cat, it would be k-at, and then the audio has to be matched to the k, to the e, to the t. Right? So there's an acoustic model that matches the audio signal to phonemes, which are the sound units. And there's a communication model or lexicon that maps from, if you have a spoken word like this, what is its communication in those units. And sometimes it's very trivial, like cats you can easily predict. But sometimes, a word like through is very hard to predict because cat communication. And then finally, there's a language model that says, how likely is this a correct sentence, right? So if I say the dog walks in the forest, that might be a normal sentence. If I say dog, cheese, that's unlikely to be a sentence. So there's a language model that models that program. So again, speech recognition is relating the audio to the text. So you sort of see from the bottom to the top, going from audio to the text. And any of these things are not particularly different from what was done before. So again, I still haven't touched on what the revolution is that things are much better. So there are a couple of peculiar things. So in lexicon, we sometimes have more URLs that we want to recognize. So how do you pronounce that URL? So it actually is go-red for women, but you might easily mispronounce it as board for women, which would be wrong. And so we have to deal with those kind of problems. We have some issues with times and monetary demands. So that is $3.22. It's not not trivial mathematics from here. But these are fairly small issues, and solving those is not the revolution that we're going for. Right? So still no revolution. Everything is fairly simple in what it was before. So the real difference is indeed artificial intelligence, and it's the revolution of what's called deep neural networks. And deep neural networks sort of came out at this time, but a very important thing to realize is that it went hand in hand with the revolution of people starting to use speech actually as a product. So had it just been the neural networks, this revolution wouldn't have happened. And to illustrate this very firmly, I was doing speech recognition in the early 90s using neural networks for speech recognition. And the revolution didn't happen at that point. And they're the same kind of models in some sense. There's nothing been dramatically different at that point. So it really is this combination of more and more data because people use it, and then because it works better, then you get more and more data. Right? So it's a cycle that actually is positive, where more people say, oh, speech recognition sort of works for me, let me use it more, but give it more data, which then allows us to make better models, which then makes it better. So that's the cycle. And you can sort of see it illustrated in these two graphs. So on the left here, you can see the blue line, which is sort of the old technology, what we used to do for acoustic modeling. And as you can see, if you get more and more data, if you go to the right, you can see that things improve, but it sort of becomes quite shallow. Right? At some point at the beginning, you can figure out how much more improvement you get. And if you look at this new deep neural network thing, you can see that you can see a big improvement from more and more data. It really knows how to make use of that extra data. On the right here, it's even more convincing. So there is a competition, like I said before, it was a product. It's called Switchboard. And there are lots of different universities and different research labs that were competing each other to have the best possible speech recognition. And as you can see, this task is very hard. And when we were doing this in 1993, the error rate was like 80%. So 8 out of 10 words would be wrong. And people really invested incredible amounts of effort in trying to make this better. And as you can see, we made a lot of improvement. But even after 12 years of research of many different sites, the error rate was still significant. It's very hard to make any more improvement. But as you can see, the vertical line is when we had the deep neural network revolution. As you can see, the error rate just took a nosedive. And that really is, so it is indeed artificial intelligence. But calling it artificial intelligence really is a bit of a misnomer here as well, because it's basically using a neural network, which is the key thing, together with a lot more data. And it's not as fancy, I think, as you would read in the popular press at the moment. So to further illustrate this, the first deep neural networks were quite simple. So again, if you look at an acoustic model, you have some kind of speech coming in, so you see the waveform on top there. And what we do is we extract some kind of acoustic features from them. So we do some kind of frequency analysis. So if you see the spectrogram here, so the time is going from left to right, and then the frequency going from along the y-axis. And then the darkness is how much of a signal you have here. And you can see there's a certain pattern here based on what people are saying. And that, time frequency representation would be input to some kind of layered network. Right? So there are deep neural networks because there's many layers. But they will all be what is called feed-forward layers. So each layer would have some kind of connections to the previous layer's output or to the input. And then its output would go through nonlinearity, and that would be the input to the next layer. And you would have a certain number of layers that eventually get to the output, and there you would estimate the probability of the phone being given the audio. So if some audio says eh, then you would like that to be classified as the eh phony and not as the p phony. So we basically train this by what is called backpropagation. So we get examples of audio and say this is an example of an E, this is an example of an U, etc. And you would give this input pattern to the network. It might get it right or might get it wrong, and the error then is backpropagated to adjust the weights of the network in the hope that if you see all data, you begin to learn what the different samples would look like. And so this was given that it worked very well. So the initial systems that people trained were beating the previous very well-tuned systems by quite a margin already, and people just went crazy. So IBM, Microsoft, all of us started really investing huge amounts of effort in this. And how deep should these networks be, and how many layers, and how much data can you use, etc. This became a huge thing. So another topic that was important is that, remember, we're still just doing the acoustic model. Right? So we're matching the audio to the harmony, but the output, of course, of speech recognition is text. Right? It's not yet the sequence of audio harmony. So something that we spend more time in also with the previous technology is something called discriminative training. And so it's easily illustrated, I think, by this picture. So if the acoustic model comes up with what is at the bottom, so let's say this reference is OK Google. And maybe the acoustic model, if you look at the outputs for the audio, it might come up with Oh Hey Google. Right? So it has a whole bunch of them right, the one we read, but it has two phonemes wrong. Right? Instead of the K, it has a H, and instead of the G, it has a D. So when it comes to training the network, they're considered equal, right? So there are two errors, and you got to propagate the errors right to make the network work correctly. Well, they're actually not worth the same. They're not worth the same for the end result. Because if you look at the Google is not a word. And Google only matches pretty well with the word Google. So the decoder will probably still output Google for that result. But hey is actually a word, right? And so instead of oh hey Google, it actually might produce oh hey Google, which is not, right? Because you want to have okay. So that K and H error is much more serious than the D and G over there because it actually causes an error. So there's a lot of effort in, it was very complicated how to do this with the previous models, and then everybody went nuts on how to do discriminative training with deep neural networks. And again, that was at least 2 years of people trying all kinds of things, different approaches to make that work. So once that started to work, then the next realization, of course, is that speech is a sequence, right? Speech is not individual sounds, so it's not all, and then the next one is good for OK Google. It's you're pronouncing it as one word, right? It's not independent of that. So an obvious better model to model the sequence is in a recurrent model, right, that actually has some notion of time. And so a recurrent model has some kind of recurrent connection, right? So there's some kind of state from the previous time step that you feed back into the next time step. And so the picture on the left there, you can see it unroll over time. So if you have x1 through xt, you can see it as the same network repeated over and over again for two time steps, where the previous time step feeds into the next step. And this is a very well-known model. So again, the neural networks were studied quite a bit ages ago. So there's nothing new here still. The problem though is that the most popular ones were RNNs. And an RNN is very hard to train. And the reason for it is if you now think of the backpropagation learning, so just like we had the deep neural network where we have the error of the outputs and we do some kind of backpropagation to train the weights. Now the backpropagation will be through time. Right? So you can learn something from x0 to the time step 0 based on the error we get at the end of the output. But that backpropagation has to go through a very long step of operations because it has to go through time. And just like a series, if something is exponential and it's smaller than 1, it will diminish to 0, or if it's bigger than 1, it will explode. So this is called the exploding or vanishing gradient code. So they're very hard to train because they're very unstable one way or the other. So then what came up is the long short-term memory, or the generalized rectified unit that you see at the bottom here. I'm not going to explain it in detail, but essentially it's a cell rather than a simple unit. Where there's some gate on it that sort of controls how much information goes in and out of it, so that you can sort of keep the gradient stable over a very long time. And so LSTMs became quite easy to train and actually do better than deep neural networks. So again, we have now another year or two where people go nuts on recurrent networks and try all possible variations on LSTM. So this actually is quite a bit of work that, like I said, I just talked over probably, just from our side, probably something like 150 to 200 papers that were done on various topics here, right? So it's a huge amount of work, but you can sort of see it's a natural progression of trying to make these models better and better and better. Trying to address things like, the objective with discriminative training, how you train these things in general, and doing this recursive modeling, which all help performance improvement. So to give you sort of an idea of how much of an impact this had. So to be honest, the old number I don't have anymore. I couldn't figure out what it is. But I think with GMMs, which is the old before neural network way of doing acoustic modeling. The error rate on this task was something like 20%. And then this distributed training is called sequence training as well, so focusing on the right errors. Makes about 20% difference, so we got the error to about 16%. And as you can see, the very first deep neural network, but this is still just feed forward, with no recurrency in there, and using cross-entropy, which is just looking at likelihood, just trying to get the label right. We already were at 11.3, so that was really the big revolution, which other sites noticed as well, that a DNN would quite easily beat a quite advanced GNN system before. And then, adding distributed training on top of that, you can see we got down to 10.4, and then putting recurrency by using LSTM, we got it down to eventually 9.8. So the 20% there, or the 16%, however you want to look at it, is the result of many decades of research, and that's sort of as well as we could do with all the tricks that we had. And so over the sequence of maybe 5 to 10 years, getting it down to about half the error rate is a very big deal. And that's sort of the real revolution. So yes, this is artificial intelligence because it's neural networks. But again, it's not really neural networks or anything intelligent, right? We're still just doing a function estimator to go as well as we can from audio input to predicting whatever the phone sequences that we think we use. So, you might say, why do I care? Because of all those numbers, but remember how awful the interaction was illustrated by the video we saw before. So if you look at it now, this is little Daniel, he's 2 years old, and he likes YouTube, particularly he likes Peppa Pig, and he doesn't know how to type at all, because he doesn't know how to write at all, but he does like his videos, and let me just show you this. So, like I said, this is a very different, so he says, okay, Google, when he shouldn't, right? And rather than saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get that, he shouldn't say, okay, Google, we just accept it, it's robust enough that it can deal with it. Clearly, he doesn't speak very clearly, but, he still gets the speech recognition right. So, it's nice to see it becomes more of a natural interface where, rather than torturing people, it's actually helpful, right? The other thing that's interesting is that, this kid will never know a world where speech recognition is not normal, right? He's just interacting with this. That's the way to interact with computers. That's normal. So actually now I think we're getting to the point where we actually go into what I call more artificial intelligence. And that's these neural models are quite capable and really have an instrumental role in making the performance of the speech recognition better. But there's a lot more stuff. Ever since machine learning has really taken off, and there's a lot of people that try to be more exploratory in what you can do with these models. And an interesting sort of side study that came out quite early is when you start thinking about what we're doing, remember, we take the audio and we compute these features, right? And we've been doing that for 50 years, right? So we know that the speech is encoded in these spectral features in a good way. But why do we do this? We have manually designed this. Can a neural network learn it by itself? And there's sort of an interesting model you can do. So at this point, on the left here, you can see the model that we liked at that point. So it's a CNN followed by 3 LSTMs followed by DNN. So that doesn't matter. It's some kind of neural network that does what I just described. It tries to map from the audio to the tone. But what you can put in front of this is a layer that is described on the picture on the left. So rather than taking these audio features that are hand designed, we just put in the raw waveform signal. Right? So you have a little waveform like on the left. And then we have a bunch of filters, as in neural weights, that we do convolution with. So we have n of these convolutional filters. And then we pull the output and pass it through a non-linearity and say that is the feature that we feed into the rest of the network. And now we can train all of it right. So we train the CNN, LSTM, DNN network to do the classification task like we just did before. So we backpropagate the error as we did before when we get the tone right. But in addition, we train these convolutional weights to come up with the feature that thinks is beautiful in making that decision. So we jointly train how to extract the feature from the waveform together with the rest of the network. And it's sort of interesting to see what you get out of this. So on the picture on the left here, the dotted line is something that is a representation that's been invented God knows how many decades ago, and has been used extensively for speech. But this comes out of a lot of hearing research, looking at how the ear works, etc., knowing that this is a good representation for speech. The green one is a gamma tone, it's a similar, differently motivated, but again, looking at what is a good representation of speech. And the squiggly ones are the ones that were trained with these models that I just described. So we just let it train and figure out whatever filters it comes up with. And once it's done training, we can look at these filters and say how they behave and sort of plot how they divide the spectrum across the filters. And it's remarkable that it comes up with a very similar distribution of filters. So it's capable of learning that representation from data without any hand design from the person. And if you look at performance there, I'm not going to go, so those are different models, but you can see essentially that we get the same performance whether they're automatically trained or they are hand designed. So the next thing that hit us is not so much a research development, but more the launch of the Amazon Echo. And so this was a new product, and it's extremely important to Google because it's a whole different way of interacting with Google that people didn't have before. So if you're in your house and you want to have some bit of information, how long should I boil my egg, or what's the name of that song, or what's the capital of some town, you can pull out your phone and you can know this, or you can speak to it. But it's a bit sort of artificial, right? And so we've all seen Star Trek, and we know that the correct way of doing it is, okay, computer, tell me something, right? And so people naturally gravitate to this, and it's sort of, it's definitely not where it is in terms of Star Trek, but people enjoy that kind of model, and it seems to make a lot of sense to use that in your house. And so these things came out, and it became a very big deal. And in fact, if you look at the amount of traffic, search traffic that comes into Google now from speech, it's a very significant percentage of all the query traffic we get. So people really enjoy putting in information like this because you're cooking or you're busy, you don't have to find where your phone is. You can just ask no matter where you are. You don't have to figure out where the machine is, you just talk to it. So it's much more natural, and but the thing that people really don't realize, normal people, is that wow, and I now have this phone, and I know I can talk to it, and it sort of works. So why wouldn't it work if I talk to some speaker that's at the other side of the room? So the reality is, if you do speech recognition, this is a topic that's been researched for a very long time. This is a very, very big difference. And the reason for it is because you have reverberation, so the sound might bounce off the wall or off the ceiling. And this confuses the speech recognizer very badly. If you take a speech recognizer that's trained on telephone speech, where people talk closely to the microphone, and you put in speech that comes from what is called far field, right? So the microphone is far from the speaker, the performance will completely fall apart to the point where it gets nothing right. So it's a very big challenging problem how to solve this. And of course my team was suddenly faced with like, we have to make this work in whatever 6 months, and we were going like, oh no. So this is a big challenge. So one of the big problems is, we know at this point, since we have so much experience with neural networks, that there's no such thing as data, right? So if neural networks do really, really well if you give them good examples of what it should learn how to do. And so we knew that's going to be a big thing, but if you think of it, this is very hard to do in the smart home kind of setting. Right? So what you want is examples of people's living room where the speaker is somewhere, and the smart speaker is somewhere, and the speaker is studying, maybe in the other side of the room, or maybe close to the thing, and then there might be noise, or there might be no noise, and there might be dog barking, or the TV might be on, or the washing machine is going on, or there's an ambulance passing by, and then everybody has different rooms, right? Some people live in a huge room and have very glass windows, so there's lots of reverberation. Some people have carpet everywhere, or a very small room. So when we started doing this, we have no previous application of this, right? So we have zero data. And if you think of getting data, one way to do it is to start building rooms and then have people speak things in those rooms, but it doesn't scale, right? How do you get examples of millions of rooms, which is sort of the kind of scale of data that you need? So what we did is we wrote this what's called room simulator. So we can have some kind of stylized way of representing a room. So for example, there's a room that's 4 meters by 12 meters. And then we can put microphones in a particular position, and we can put a speaker in a particular position. And then we can basically put a noise source in a particular position. And then we have maybe some parameters of it. So the P60 is how reverberant the room is. So for example, it's very reverberant like a glass room, or it's not very reverberant because it's also carbon. And then we can set how much the speech is louder than the noise or vice versa. And then what we did is we wrote a simulator and then took close talking stuff so that we get from the phone application. And then simulate how it would sound like if it's from a distance in a particular configuration. And this is now software generated, we can generate data from millions of rooms sort of on the fly, making up stuff as we go along. And we sort of sample from what is likely to be people's living. Right? So we wouldn't consider an opera hall because it's unlikely that people would have a living room like that, but we would sort of cover normal conditions you would see with different households. So then something you can do is what's been studied for a very long time. This is called multi-channel enhancement. So this is sort of a complicated slide, and you don't have to completely understand it. But the idea would be if you have 3 microphones, like on the right there, and they're some distance apart B, and you have this audio waveform coming in at a particular angle, right? So you can see data over there. The audio comes in from somewhere. You can imagine that it's going to hit microphone number 1, X1 over there, slightly before it's going to hit microphone X2 a little bit later. And so, if you know the angle, then you can figure out what that delay would be between one microphone and the next. So if you delay the signal from the different microphones and you add them all up, you get some kind of directional selectivity. So if you see at the bottom right there, you get a particular pattern saying, I'm going to emphasize the sound I hear from this direction, and I'm going to suppress whatever I get from a different direction. So if you have the direction right, then that helps, right? Because you specifically listen to that particular direction and you suppress whatever comes from here. And obvious problem is that if you get it wrong and you think that the audio comes from there, then you destroy the signal because you're suppressing actually where it comes from and you're amplifying it wrong. So there's been lots and lots of work on this for many decades, and of course we tried all of it. But if you do this on real data, we frequently found that the estimation of where the audio comes from already breaks, and then everything goes the hell out of it. So we were quite desperate to have to make this work because it's very complicated. But in general, sort of looking at all the previous work, generally what people would do, they would separate enhancement. So they're sort of trying to boost the signal from the audio. They would do it separately from the recognition. Right? So you first try to get the audio cleaned up, and then we get the recognition. And the enhancement itself has sort of like three stages to it. So one of them would be localization, so trying to figure out where is my audio come from. And then once you have that figured out, you do beamforming, so this is delaying the signals for the different microphones and try to emphasize the signal from the direction that you think is coming from. And then maybe post-filtering to make sure that it still sounds natural and not making it sound completely different. And the general way to do this is what's called filter and sum. So essentially you can see the formula there. You have some filters H of C for each of the channels, and then you have the signal coming in X of C, where you give it some steering delay, right? So it's delay to line things up. And then there's various objectives that people use to optimize this. And so it's very complicated. And like I said, what we found is it to be very fragile. Right? So if you do this in a laboratory setting, it works quite well. And there's quite impressive papers on how to do this. But once we started doing this with our noisy real-life data, it really gets very hard to make it work. In fact, we saw nothing but negative results coming out of this. But coming back to that low waveform thing I just mentioned, putting that kind of filter and some structure into a neural network is quite easy. Right? So if you take the picture on the left here, again, you have our neural network entity on top here. Right? So this is still the same acoustic model that tries to go from audio to predicting the phonics. And then in front of it, you see this thing where we have different filters that are then summed together and then put into the rest of the network. So now what we say is that the filter in something, how do we make the network run it? And then actually, if you think of the filters, what they do, there's sort of two tasks that these filters do. One of them is frequency, so they might actually focus on a particular sound, just like we saw with the raw waveform, to encode the different audio sounds. And the other thing is this spatial filter, right? So we want to listen to a particular direction and suppress something else. And so the spatial ones are very short filters. The frequency selective ones are slightly longer. So we can actually factor them to have short filters and long filters, and then all of them run together, what we call factor. And the interesting thing of this approach is that there's no more localization first, right? So we implicitly ask the network to figure out where the audio comes from. So this is probably 50 papers that have gone into this, and there's really a huge body of work on this. But to give you an idea, so without the simulator, things completely break. So there's no point in even coding any kind of error rate. So you can get it up to 100% for error rate, no problem. With the room simulator, things work reasonably well. And with this filter stuff we just described, you can get about another 20% improvement on top of that, doing that. And so what's interesting to look at is at the right. So those are those learned filters for doing the multi-channel processing. And what you can do is on the right is sort of split the response of those filters into two dimensions. One of them is the DOA, the direction of arrival. So this is their spatial reaction. So you can see it goes from 0 to 180 degrees. If it's highlighted, it means it lets it through. If it's dark, it means it's pressed it. So you can see some of them, like the top filter, or the one just second from the bottom, you can see these sort of stripes. But those filters are very spatially selected, right? So they suppress from a particular angle, and they let through from a particular other angle. And some of them, you can see, have just a band. They're more frequency selected. So it's learning actually something similar to what you would do by hand design, but again, by learning it from data. And again, the 20% improvement is an indication that it actually gives us some benefit, even though we don't really understand how it does it or what it does. And as I mentioned, this is all based on simulated data. So the last thing we did is we bought one of those things, which is an artificial mouth, I'm not kidding. So we actually got a real room and we played back some of the audio that we have through that thing which simulates the person speaking, and tested on that, and actually saw that the model actually worked pretty well. And even once we launched it and actually get real user traffic, the model seems to hold up quite well. We have very little complaints about the recognition performance of that product. All right, now I'm getting into much more real artificial intelligence. So, as I mentioned before, we were still doing things mostly in the acoustic model, right? So we're still looking at how to go from the audio to phonics. But if you look at the system, we have this language model, pronunciation model, and acoustic model. Right? So there's still 3 different components rather than one neural network. And so something that's now very popular is what is called encoder-decoder models. And so rather than, so the realization again is why do we need to have phonemes and a language model, etc. Can't we just learn the whole thing from scratch? Right? So these models are, the acoustic audio comes in, and we have the output as the text. And what if we build a model in between that makes absolutely no assumptions, has no structure, it's just a neural network. So there's an encoder which takes the audio coming in and produces some kind of feature sequence, so that's the encoder sequence H in the middle. And then we have a decoder that produces output symbols that produce the characters that you want to get out. And by the internal state, it pays attention to the encoder sequence, right? So it tries to pick up, what is the next evidence for the next character that I'm going to produce. And what you can see on the left here, there's sort of the encoder sequence here. So it looks something like the audio representation I showed before. And the intention is sort of know which part of that audio it picks up on to produce the next output something. And these models are remarkably effective. So they're very, very small. They're perform very, very well. And it's remarkable that trained at all. And the other interesting thing of it is that they completely make no independence assumption. Right? So the IF output symbol is dependent on everything before and on the entire input system. All of the audio, all of the previous symbols. There's no more sort of trying to make the model simpler because we couldn't deal with it before. So these are very, very interesting and powerful models. But as usual, it's not free. So there's a whole bunch of problems that come up. And I'm not going to go into a very large amount of detail, but to give you an idea how something can be a very interesting model, but still needs a lot of research before you can figure out how to deal with it. So one of them is, for example, we have a lot of text. So we have not had the audio, just the text. And before we built a very big language model, this is a good way to get a good model of language. And now, if we don't have any input, the end-to-end model needs to have a pair of audio together with the text. And if you don't have that, how do you deal with this? So what we can do is build a language model and try to fuse it with whatever goes on. So when the model is doing its work of decoding whatever the next symbol is, we can manipulate whatever the search is by also including the language model score, right, to reorder it. And as you can see, the top here, you can see the performance without any language model. The second one, when we had a small language model. The third one, we had a big language model, and then we joined. As you can see, you get a nice improvement by doing this. But it is, again, something to figure out. Again, this is a month of work to try to figure out how to do this effectively and actually get it here. So, what is previously very easy to just have a language model now becomes a research topic on how to make use of that with these new models. So something else that is important is if you talk to Google, you want the answer as soon as you're done talking, right? If I say, how tall is Barack Obama, I immediately want to get the answer. So if we start processing your audio by the time I'm done speaking, there's a very annoying delay that happens, right? So even if the speech recognizer is as fast as you talk, if you talk for 3 seconds and then you have to wait for 3 seconds, that's a very unpleasant experience. So even though these models are fantastic, that they make no independence assumptions, you can see on the right here that the repetition of that model is dependent on all of the audio. So it can't really start working until it's seen all of the audio because it should be able to do it all. So making them online to be able to produce an answer as we speak is not trivial. So one of the things we did is what is called this blocking thing. And so rather than depending on the entire input, we depend on a block. And then let the decoder at some point produce a special symbol end of block, saying I'm done with this block, and I'll move to the next one. And like that we can make it online. And interesting enough, if you do this, you lose quite a bit, but if you initialize it with the offline trained model, you actually lose absolutely nothing. So again, this is another 3 months of work to make this work, but again, a very important thing to tackle. The last thing that we have a big problem with is if you actually talk to Google, there are many, many names in the world. Everybody has a different name. And if you look at the traffic of all of you guys, you see 5 million different names. But it's unlikely that any one of you has actually 5 million friends. Right? So the probability of the different names, if I look at everybody, might be sort of flat. Right? There might be 5 million names that are all equally likely. But if I do recognition for you, then you might only have 50 friends. And so what you want to do is you want to make those 50 friends' names much more likely than the other 5 million that you don't know. So what we do now when you talk to Google is that if you say call somebody, we quickly put in all your contacts to make sure we try to get your friend's name right, and not some random name that we otherwise don't know. So it's called biasing, right? So there's a more general thing that in some cases you're likely going to say something, so you want to make sure that the recognizer knows that. And so in the old model, it's quite easy, right? We can manipulate the language model right before we recognize and make that happen. But these end-to-end models, we have no idea what the language model and conversation model and all of that is. It's just one neural thing. So what we look at quite a bit is this structure you have on the left. So the audio encoder, attention decoder is that end-to-end model that I just described. So we have a second attention mechanism where the bias input is, for example, the names of your contact. And like that, the decoder can say, I'm looking at the audio that comes in, but in addition, I can pay attention to some of the names that are apparently imported because they're coming in through the bias. As you can see here, the LAS number here is without doing that. And these are particular, this is when you ask for a song, this is for a particular contact, etc. As you can see, we had a huge improvement by offering that as a side input. So again, the more general thing is these models are very interesting and they are compact and have all kinds of benefits. They also have a bunch of challenges that were not a challenge before, but still have to work somehow in between models. I think I said all of this. End-to-end models are good, very interesting, and very, very active research, but they're also challenging because they're pretty active research. Right. A little bit about what we do here, and it's a bit related to the end-to-end models. So I started a new group 2 years ago here in Tokyo. So these are the 6 members that are there. So we're sort of half real speech people and half some of other general machine learning people. And the focus is, as I stated in the introduction, to focus a bit on speech recognition as well as other stuff. And I'll try to make it a bit more plausible with some examples. So if I speak to an international audience, I have to spend a long time on this slide, but I don't have to do this for you guys. So Japanese is an interesting language in the sense that it has a very complicated relationship between the orthography and the pronunciation. Right? So if you look at the sentence at the bottom, it's not very far-fetched. It has 5 occurrences of the day or some character, and they all have different pronunciations just because they're part of different things. Right? Tsunitachi, Ichiobi, etc. And so in the speech recognition system, of course, we have to deal with this problem. Right? We have to somehow be able to predict accurately what we expect the pronunciation to be so we can match it to the audio. And that's very non-trivial. So in addition, there are no spaces in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. And that's sort of spoiled whatever we did before because all these models are sort of based on tokens. Right? We like to make independence assumptions. And if things are a sequence of events, then it's easy to forget something and have an easier probabilistic model. And so of course it doesn't work with CJK languages. And how do engineers deal with this? Well, they force it anyway by just doing something. And so the segmenter was quite easily invented and it's actively used, and it's a really, really bad idea. So the most popular thing is what's called Mekabu. If you're doing speech and language, I'm pretty sure that you know about this. This is invented by Taku Kudo, who's in our office. And essentially what it does is, for example here, Tokyo told Mitsumu, it makes a lattice like and has a probabilistic model to try to figure out what's the most likely path through that lattice to decide on how to segment it. And you can imagine if you get the wrong path here, it's completely broken. Right? So Higashi Kyoto will really be the wrong pronunciation. But if you look at the basic makeup mode that comes with your Linux workstation, it's very trivial to make it get an error. Right? So the example I just gave you, the Tsunitachi already becomes Ichi, and you're dead. Right? So in addition to it not being a good idea, it also brings about all kinds of problems. If you look at the resources from the Mekabu system, you can tell there's lots and lots of hand design and effort in there to make this work. Right? So there's endless lists of nouns and other part of speech tags and all that stuff. So maintaining it or just dealing with it is a pain. And if you want to update this because there's some new word or screwed up on something, it's very, very fragile and not a good idea. So a very interesting experiment you can do with these end-to-end models is to say, if I take some speech and I have the transcript, so I have the kana kanji sequence. So I take Mekabu and I allow it to come up with any possible pronunciation of it. And now I take one of our speech recognition models and figure out what phoneme sequence we think we produced. So now I have lots and lots of string pairs. Right? So I say this is the sequence of characters for orthography, and I also know what the sequence of phonemes are. Right? So I think I know this sentence is pronounced like this. Right? And now I have 3 million pairs of text and audio. And now I can put this in one of these end-to-end models and say, no megaboob, no segmented, it's just a string-to-string model. Can I predict from speech to phones, or from phones to graphics, or from graphics to phones? And you can see these are the error rates. So these are not the real error rates, because I'm just trying to see how well it can do what megaboob does. But as you can see, the errors are quite small for given that there's no manual stuff. So there's no megaboob here whatsoever. It just learns what megaboob does from just example. And the other thing that's interesting you can do is you can say, what if I hold this jointly, right? If I go from speech to phoneme as well as graphic. Right? So like on the right there, you can have one encoder that takes the input signal, and then try to come up with both the phone sequence as well as the graphic. And as you can see, the error rates particularly going to the orthography going to the graphic sequence is not easy. But you can see it's not unreasonable. So we did actually quite a bit of work on this. The problem with the joint model here, if you do speech to phoneme and grapheme, the two decoders are still independent. Right? So they don't know of each other when they're trying to come up with the answer. So we work on this iterative refinement. So you go from speech to phoneme and grapheme, but then you can input all of that into the next stage, where in the middle you get the audio, you still have the speech, and on the left and the right you get the phoneme or grapheme output of the previous stage, and then from there try to predict the output again. Right? And now it can model dependency because the phoneme decoder can look at what the previous grapheme decoder output, and so they're not independent anymore. And as you can see, it's interesting that it actually works. So for a single pass, you get 8.8 error on phoneme and 18.6 on grapheme. If you do this two-headed thing, where you do both phonemes and grapheme, you can see it does more or less the same, slightly better. But if you do this refinement, then you can get quite a bit of improvement. So we're not particularly just focused on Japanese. There's a more interesting problem here. Right? So frequently you don't want just the text. You want actually just from speech to text and potentially other annotations, right? And natural understanding. And those genuine models are interesting because you can do this joint modeling of these things together and hopefully have a better model that makes a lot more sense than just producing the convention. And the end-to-end models are pretty interesting because they're string to string. Like you said, this megaboob makes errors early on as a hard decision, and they're fatal. Right? There's no way to get that. So jointly modeling this and not making a hard decision. For example, what we now do is we go from speech to text, and we give the text to the natural language understanding people. We try to produce the natural language understanding from the text. But that's also a hard decision that maybe is not a good idea. So jointly modeling this in one of these end-to-end models seems to be potential for doing more interesting models. So this is sort of the more general idea, right? So if you have an encoder of the speech coming in, can you do various annotation tasks that are not just doing the grapheme decoder, which is speech recognition, but potentially do phonemes, part of speech, parse trees, etc., etc. And that's sort of the focus of the current group. So there are other topics, and this is just one slide, I'm not going to go into this. But something we learned from BERT, which is a very popular model, is that to make this work well, if the encoder is very good, so if the encoder transforms the speech into a representation that knows a lot about the language, then all of these higher level annotators have a much easier job doing whatever they do. And so this brings up a topic called representation learning, saying how can you come up with the best encoder that makes it easier to do higher level tasks. And so something that's quite popular that came out of DeepMind is called CPC, compressive predictive coding. And so it's again this encoder-decoder model, so you have a waveform coming in, and you have this encoder layer, so this is the encoder part of the model that comes up with some kind of latent representation in the middle. And then you have the decoder on top, which is the autoregressive thing at top. But rather than predicting labels directly, what you're trying to do is you come up with a vector and say, from that vector, how well can I predict what's going to come next? Because that's what the inherent signal that's in the speech signal. And if that learns as well, you can come up with something that's a reasonable representation. So they showed that if you train this, doing font classification on that representation is very, very simple. It's a very, very simple classifier that has very high accuracy in doing font classification. And there's no labels required for this as well. So you don't need to have transcribed data. You can actually learn from just speech. It doesn't have to know what it's being said. So I would claim that this is somewhat actually artificial intelligence rather than what people now call artificial intelligence by doing function estimation of audio decoding. In summary, I think I gave you the whirlwind tour of speech recognition going from horrible to, I think, right now accepted. Again, artificial intelligence is a term I have somewhat of a problem with, but I think you now understand why. The end-to-end model is, I think, more interesting. So machine learning becomes much more entangled with speech, and I think in a good way. I think there's interesting models to be learned there. And like I said, there's a new effort in the Tokyo office. So if you're graduating anytime soon, please come and contact me. Thank you.